Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and students. I'm very happy to welcome all of you in this lecture hall of Radboud University on behalf of the Stichting Internationale Spinoza Prize, Boom Publishers in Amsterdam and Radboud Reflects. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our guest this evening, Professor Dominique Moïsi. He is a very influential and well-known political scientist and a professor of international relations. He has written several books. In 2009, he published The Geopolitics of Emotions. And more recently, in 2016, he published The Geopolitics of Series. Now, this book has been translated into Dutch, published this year by Boom in Amsterdam. So you can read it all in Dutch now if you want. Dominique Moïsi is here for a very special reason. He was awarded for his 2009 The Geopolitics of Emotion. He was awarded the International Spinoza Lens. That's a biannual prize that is given to renowned thinkers in the field of ethics and society. And obviously Dominique Moïsi is one of those very well-known thinkers. This evening, he is going to speak about the topic of his just translated into Dutch book, The Geopolitics of Series. So the question is, why are television series such as Game of Thrones, Homeland and House of Cards so immensely popular? Now, Dominique Moïsi is going to argue that this is because these series reflect upon the emotions that are dominant in geopolitics today. If we want to understand the world, then movies and television series might be the best option we have to understand what is going on and what the emotions are that govern this political event. Now, the program of today is very simple. First, Professor Moïsi will give a lecture of about 30 minutes. Then he will engage in a discussion with Arjen Klein-Herenbrink, who is a professor at our own university, Radboud University. And after this interview, you will have the occasion to ask questions. My name is Paul Bakker. I am the director of Radboud Reflects, and I wish you all a very inspiring evening. And now I give the floor to Dominique Moïsi.
Very high. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. This is the last conference I give in 3 days after an extremely heavy program. That started in the University of Leuven in Belgium, and that ends in Nijmegen. In fact, I think this is the second time I give the Radboud lecture in a period of 5 years or something like that. Let me try to tell you why I wrote the book and how writing the book changed me in the course of writing it. I'm not a specialist of television series. In fact, I had barely watched television series before I started to write the book. My specialty is geopolitics, and I tried to bring to geopolitics the dimension of the subjectivity, of the effects, of the emotion. And the geopolitics of emotion went very well. And I was asked to prolong it, to update it. And as the guillotine of age had fallen upon my shoulders, and I could no longer teach in France because of our age rules. I was invited to teach at King's College in London. And I chose the following topic: the triumph of fear. And my publisher was very, very pleased. He said, "That's such a good title. Can you convert your course into an essay?" And I even signed a contract. And I spent the summer writing. And I was not happy with the result. I don't know. There was something. I fear that I was repeating myself, that I didn't want to concentrate on negative emotions, that I was not doing the good thing. And my children turned to me and said, "But Father, Dad, how can you write about fear if you have not seen Game of Thrones?" So I nearly said to them, "What is that?" And I proceeded to watch the first episode of the first season. And I really disliked it intensely. So much violence, incest from the very beginning of the series. I said, "Well, wait." And dragoons. I said to myself, "But I'm too old. I come from another culture. I have nothing to do with it." But then I realized television series had become the most discussed cultural media of the day. Whenever I would go to a Parisian dinner, people would ask me, "Have you seen such episode of such series?" And I thought to myself, well, if television series have become the equivalent of what the feuilletons were in 19th century France or Great Britain, maybe I should watch them. And I went back to my publisher and I said, maybe, I found the way to return to my field, to my title. And he was enthusiastic because I realized no one had ever written a book, not on television series. It's now a field very well known and very much written about, but on the geopolitics on television series. And I started to read, I started to watch, and I realized that there was a topic. That if I wanted to continue to concentrate on emotion, I was right to follow that path. But of course, there were enormous difficulties. There are hundreds and hundreds of television series. How could I watch them all and not become a zombie while writing them? So I had to set to myself very rigid, Protestant ethic-like rule to select the series. And I chose my criteria in the following manner. I had to watch a series that dealt directly or indirectly with geopolitics. I had to select a series that was or had been successful, universally, being watched from the West to the east, popular in Asia as well as in Western Europe or America. I had to watch a series that was good, whose quality was high. And of course, this is very subjective. But I had the press, the critics, to orient me. And then I had to watch a series that was still on, that was reflecting the emotions I wanted to describe. And so I came across a very, very severe process of selection, and I chose 5 series, and 5 series only, all extremely well known. And those series were, of course, Game of Thrones, of course, Downton Abbey, of course, Homeland, of course, House of Cards, and less obvious, a little known but remarkable Norwegian series by the name of Occupied. And with this series, I had the feeling I was covering my topic. With Game of Thrones, I touch with my finger the fear of chaos, of absolute and total disorder. With Downton Abbey, I touched something very different, which was the nostalgia for a social order that was disappearing. With Homeland, I touch the issue of terrorism. With House of Cards, the issue of the crisis of democracy in the Western world. And with Occupied, the fear of Russia returning to haunt part of Eastern, Nordic, and Central Europe. In Game of Thrones, I met Hobbes and Machiavelli. And I called it Hobbes at the time of the Dragoon. Hobbes is an English philosopher of the second half of the 17th century who wrote a famous book called Leviathan, saying basically in one sentence, man is a wolf to man. And Hobbes was writing after the British Civil War of the mid-17th century. The defeat of the Catholic monarchy, the decapitation of Charles I, the taking of power by Cromwell. But what was interesting is that Game of Thrones was based on a famous fantasy novel whose idea started with the War of Roses that was very cruel and brutal in the England of the second half of the 15th century, defeated the failure by the English to take over and to keep control of France. And it ended up in a civil war. And the author of the book wanted to recreate a world that would combine the barbarism of the Middle Ages, the War of Roses, and the attraction of the antiquity, and also in some parts you see Nordic legend, the kingdom of the north, and Byzance, the kingdom of the south. And I watched it with frustration initially, then growingly with addiction. At some point, I said to my wife, this is enough. I had seen the so-called moment when there is the blood wedding, where everybody, especially the good people, are all killed in a wedding ceremony. And I said, okay, I understood. I stop. I can write without going further. And of course, in the morning, I woke up and said to my wife, well, maybe I have to watch a little more. Maybe I'm not sure of the interpretation I'm giving. She realized I was addicted. And my addiction was not only the result of the fact that it was very well done, with huge means, good actor, enormous means, but that it was extremely well written. I mean, there are moments when dialogue seemed to be coming out from Shakespeare or Machiavelli. And above all, I realized that I was not watching the Middle Ages, but the Middle East. And the intuition came to me very rapidly when I saw the execution of ISIS on internet. They followed the path of the Game of Thrones. You are presented with the person who is going to die in front of you, and then when the execution has taken place, there's another person that is being presented. That's going to be the next victim. In Game of Thrones, in the first seasons, if you remember, at the end of an episode, you would see someone and you would realize that this was more or less the last time you would see him or her, because she would disappear in the next episode. To the point where I asked myself, but it's obvious that those terrorists have watched Game of Thrones, that this kind of public execution through internet are inspired to them by the television series. And when you watched the news not long ago and you heard about the terrible barbaric execution of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was first strangled and then dismembered by Saudi secret services, you say, but of course, this barbarism has been described by Game of Thrones. It's not the Middle Age, it's the Middle East. And I thought maybe there's something there. And there were so many scenes which were impressive from that standpoint. I mean, at some moment, there's a good hero, John Stark, who preaches to accept the refugees. And he's very like Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel was destroyed politically for her good action. John Stark is murdered and will rebound in an extraordinary way. And so I said, well, maybe I'm on something with those television series. Downton Abbey, well, personally, I love that. It's my age group. After you've seen decapitation in Game of Thrones, you want to have a tea with Maggie Smith over your chimney in your comfortable Chesterfield couch and enjoy eating little biscuit with your finger up while watching Downton Abbey. It's very reassuring. But beyond the joke, Downton Abbey is about Tocqueville. It's Tocqueville. It's the presentation of a dying social order about to be replaced by a new one, with a huge sense of the inevitability of the change and a huge sense of nostalgia for the order that existed. Just read Democracy in America. It describes what the world will be soon in Europe when the American model will slowly come to Western Europe. And this television series is also fascinating because it got universal reaction. In Asia, people were fascinated with the lifestyle of the English gentleman in his castle. But they were also fascinated, I think, by the fact that they were seeing a style of life that had not only disappeared, but that was the cause for the disappearance of the Western superiority. They were watching the past of Europe and the reasons for the decline of Europe at the same time. Homeland, well, interesting thing is that initially it's an Israeli series. Chatufim, prisoners of war. But in the Israeli series, it's like a Chekhov play. You see few actors looking at each other in the eyes, the impact of the fact that someone who has been taken prisoner may have been turned against his own side by an ideological conversion. The moment it becomes an American series, the means are much bigger. It becomes a reflection on power and what to do vis-à-vis terrorism. And you can see through the evolution of the episode, the evolution of America vis-à-vis itself. So after 9/11, it starts with righteousness. They are savages. We have to destroy them. But then the war in Iraq doesn't go well. Not well at all. And there is a moment of self-reflection. Maybe they pushed us to have the worst come from us. And there's that moment when one of the heroes say, an American, nothing good can come from our presence in the Middle East. In French, you would say, qu'allait-il faire dans cette galère? Like Molière in Les Fourberies. And that's quite interesting, the evolution of the series. So, self-righteousness, doubt. And when terrorism returned in Europe, toughness returns. The series follows the present as much as it precedes it. That is what I found most interesting, the interaction between fiction and reality. Then come House of Cards. Here again, it was a British television series that described in the 1990s the plot and the fall of Margaret Thatcher in the Conservative Party. And the British television series is extremely witty, terribly cruel, quite essentially British. In a way, you nearly have to be British to follow it. And now they ask the same writers, the same people, to export the theme and to bring it to America. And it becomes a universal reflection on the crisis of democracy. And somewhere it describes all the reasons that brought Trump to power in 2016. The polarization of society, the unbalance of powers in America, the crisis of the media, the alienation with politics and politicians, the loss of confidence in the elite. It's all there. The problem is that the moment Trump was elected president of the United States, I stopped watching House of Cards. It was boring. The fiction was nothing compared to reality. When you can watch freely Donald Trump, Underwood in comparison is a combination between Machiavelli and Kissinger. And so you say, well, why should I watch that? I have the reality that is much stronger, much better if I want to enjoy myself or be this desperate about the evolution of reality. And then I came across a fascinating jewel, a Norwegian television series by the name of Occupied, done with very little means, not the same amount of money, but that is in itself a first course, first class introduction to geopolitics. You want to know what geopolitics is about? Watch Occupied. It has a great economy of means, and it combines everything that is essential to understand the evolution of Europe today. A terrible, disparaging treatment of the European Union. In the series, the European Union is pissed off by Norway that has abandoned carbon-type energy for ecological reasons, and is encouraging Russia to invade Norway, to change the government that exists. And in that series, you see little black man that looked very much like the little green man that seized Crimea before. But in reality, the series was written before the seizure of Crimea by the Russian. Here again, it's fascinating. What is that link between fiction and reality? And at the end of this exercise, I was dissatisfied again, because all the series I described were emphasizing the triumph of fear over hope. And I said, well, there's no series today that has the spirit of West Wing, the optimism, the better-than-life president, Bartlett, Nobel Prize, good husband, more or less, good father, really, and a good man. We moved from Bartlett to Underwood. Can we go back to Bartlett and West Wing? And I found nothing. So I decided to write my own script for a television series. And I called it Balance of Power, the old classical thing. And I invented in it the love story between a beautiful Chinese spy and a very handsome American spy, Colonel Liu and Major Adam. And I show them saving the world from North Korea madness, from ecological threats about to destroy the humanity. I knew it was not realistic, but I wanted to say, well, let's end on an optimistic note. Let's see whether it can happen. Well, basically, let me round up my approach. It starts with the request from my student, update the geopolitics of emotion. It is based on an ethical principle. I want to explain the complexity of the modern world to as large an audience as possible. And I said to myself, geopolitics is too important to be ignored. But I realize a lot of people are bored with geopolitics or find it not in their field. So I'm telling them, you can't ignore it, because if you are not interested in geopolitics, geopolitics is interested in you. So follow me. You love television series. I will guide you through some series and give you an introductory course on international relations with some sense of values. And I can do that because television series have become serious. Television series have become good. They have nothing to do with what Dallas or Derek, you were not born, were. They have become major because of money. Money goes to money. The best actor accept to go there because they realize they have huge audiences and they will get huge fees. The best scenarist become scenarist of television series. They are recruited in the literature department from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. They select the best. And they say, we pay you more. You have an A+ in literary studies, come with us. And it helps the scenario of television series now, because they have more means, are very often much more imaginative than the scenario of movies. But, and I really don't know when I started, so I really don't know whether I've exceeded my time or I'm close to the end of my time. Let me give you my final message. The day I finished my manuscript, and I did a serious research work, which means I chose very few series, but I watched every episode, every season, sometimes twice, to be sure that I had understood the message. But the moment I gave my manuscript back to my publisher, I went immediately into a bookshop and rushed to buy a new version, new translation of War and Peace by Tolstoy. And I advise you to do that. Watch television series, but don't forget to read. This is the most important thing. Don't become prisoner of those television series. They can be very good, but nothing is better than a book. A book opens your imagination. You don't see Natasha. You don't see Pierre Bezukhov. You don't see Prince Andrei. You read about them. You imagine them. They are much, much more powerful because of that. So don't become prisoner of television series. Thank you very much. I have my glass. I'll use that. Yeah, I spoke 30 minutes.
Yes, we have a lot of time. Thank you very much for the lecture, for the introduction. What I would like to do is just go into a few things that you write about in the book and that you have just said in the talk. The first thing I want to ask by way of anecdote, for about 1 year now, I've managed to convince my girlfriend to finally start watching science fiction and fantasy movies. And I thought, well, now that she has finally agreed to it, we'll start with things that I like, which are things from the 80s and 90s. And after a few, I asked her, what did you think? And she said, there's one thing that strikes me about all of this, like Star Wars, Star Trek, and so on. She says, there's always a federation. Why is there always a federation of nations and groups of good guys and good people that band together? Because that's nowhere to be seen in today's television and film landscape. And this is a theme that I think always returns throughout the book is that these series are about a disappointment in politics and almost seem to reflect an idea that it is impossible today to put your trust into things like the United Nations, the European Union, true international alliances, and so on. Why do you think that this mistrust is present today?
Well, we are seeing the triumph of cynicism, fear over hope. And in a way, it reflects the situation in which we live and the failure of elites to convince people that they are doing the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. This growth of cynicism, you can watch it in the rise of populist forces all over the world, the rise of illiberal democracy over a classical liberal democracy. What went wrong? We did it to ourselves to a large extent. If you take America, you have the overreaction to 9/11 that followed the under-preparation before 9/11. Then 10 years, nearly 10 years after the financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2008, Donald Trump comes to power. Carried by the culture of anger and rage. I mean, if I were to write a new version of the geopolitics of emotion today, I would add anger at fear, humiliation, and hope. And in this context of diffidence, it's normal that you don't see trust. I think that the key word, in a way for me, has always been the word confidence. I mean, you have to find three dimensions. Confidence in yourself, respect for the other and the difference of other, and emphasis on the dignity of human being. And in Game of Thrones, you find a combination of just the opposite. I cannot trust anyone, not even my closest friends or family. It's a pure situation of power. Homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to wolf. And that's where you see. I mean, in series like, in film like Star Wars, or in science fiction movies like E.T. by Spielberg, you have a domination of humanism. Spielberg makes movie nearly like a rabbi would preach a sermon. He has a kind of ethical vision of life. The people who make House of Cards, Game of Thrones, say to themselves, well, the world has dramatically changed. If I were to follow the path of Spielberg, no one would believe me. So it's it's a dialectical process. You want to describe the reality or what you think the evolution of the reality is, and it becomes an encouragement. How to make sure that this stops somewhere. This is what I've been trying to do.
That's also what you mentioned about the isomorphy between ISIS decapitations online and decapitations in Game of Thrones. It reminds of this idea that it's been established quite frequently that, for example, gang members and young mafia members in the United States they copy the aesthetics from things like Scarface and the Godfather movies up to the point where you can no longer tell with today's criminals whether they are actual criminals or that, you know, follow in the footsteps of their really existing forebearers, or if they are acting the part. And this is also this hypothesis that has returned in the media over and over again, that maybe people, young men who travel to Syria to fight, are not so much doing this for religious motives, but because they have been implicitly or explicitly raised with a certain culture of heroism, action, adventure stories, and so on, Western pop culture, and this seems to be for them the only place in the world where they can actually live that life. Would that also be in line with your thinking?
Well, when it comes to the roots of Islamic fundamentalism, you have two schools of thinking. According to one, what we are witnessing is the Islamization of radicals. You have radicals people, inheritor, if you want, of the nihilist of the late 19th century, but in order to present their case in a more honorable way, they don't say, I love violence, I love to kill. They say, I have a mission from Allah, who chose me. And if you follow that school of thinking, the rise of Daesh, ISIS, is a direct imitation of 19th century nihilist applied to 21st century marginals. There's another school of thought who says, no, what we are witnessing is not the Islamization of radicals, but the radicalization of Islam. And somewhere the answer is, it's both. The Islamization of radicals is essential to understand what may happen in the neighborhood of big cities, in the suburbs. The radicalization of Islam is fundamental to understand what's happening in the Middle East. And somewhere it's both are linked. And what I'm trying to say is that what is essential today is to explain and understand the complexity of the world. Populism means rejecting the complexity. This is what populism is about. The refusal to accept the complexity of the world in which we live, and the refusal to accept that there might be different point of views, different opinions. This is, I would say, at the core, what it is all about. But we bear a responsibility for that. We, meaning Western liberal political elite, because we failed in our democratic pedagogy, and we retreated into a demagogic simplification.
And because of these failures, it almost seems as if nowadays, if you want to be a very successful politician, you totally have to present yourself as an anti-politician. You have to say, I am not a politician, I am going to drain the swamp. And this is something common to Putin, Erdogan, Trump, many others. Also here in the Netherlands, we have our Forum for Democracy, whose leader says, I am the intellectual who is an anti-intellectual, so I am here to show all the other idiots that have an education that their education is something that they got wrong, and so on. So you have this aesthetics of, to use the word you used in your lecture, of toughness, almost.
Yeah, but I will answer indirectly to your question. what I found very interesting is that television series coming from authoritarian, despotic regime are self-glorification. If you look at Chinese series, I happened to see some of them while in China or in South Korea. They are about the glory of the empire. And they're beautifully done. It's the such emperor fighting to enlarge his scope, whatever, in the 12th century, in the 13th century. But they are watched by millions and millions of people, but mostly only Chinese. I mean, no American, no European has seen a Chinese television series. Go to Russia, same thing. The television series are about the glorification of the nation. And so you see World War II, fighting the Nazis. And you see the Cold War, fighting the nasty CIA agent. We, in the democratic world, are not about self-glorification, but self-deprecation. We look at ourselves and describe ourselves sometimes in a worse manner than we are. I remember as I was writing this book, I was traveling to China. I was invited to accompany Angela Merkel to one of our official trips. So I had access to the people in the Forbidden City. And at the official dinner, I told them, well, you know, I'm writing this book. What are you watching in China? And the answer was very simple. Well, the young people, they like Game of Thrones. But we, at the top, we love House of Cards. Because it shows how hypocritical the Americans are. You know, they accuse us in the name of human rights, democracy, respect for the opposition. But look, this president, he kills people. The fight for power is in America as tough as it is in China. And I think in the long run, what I'm trying to say is that, is that it's better to criticize yourself, even a bit too much, than to self-glorify yourself. In the short run, it may be easier, but in the long run, you don't see the reality of the world as it is. And there are countries, which I didn't mention tonight, that are great producer of television series. The Turks, about the glory of the Ottoman Empire. The Brazilian, it's more soap opera-like. A loves B, but B loves D. And then what do we do with that? And there's no geopolitics in the Brazilian series. There's so much violence in society. I mean, in the last 10 years, 600,000 Brazilians died from a bullet. The exact equal number of the total of people killed in the Syrian civil war. On an average, so I don't think they want to see, when 60,000 people are killed like that, some of them by accident, I don't think they want to see political series. They are in escapism.
I have a question about that, because when, especially concerning the China thing, last year there was a movie, I forget the title, which is bad, but it stars Jackie Chan.
Yes.
And it's about the Silk Road, long, long ago.
Yeah.
And Jackie Chan is kind of a warden who has to keep all kinds of tribes and nations at peace while they're trading at the Silk Road.
Yeah.
And at some point, there's even a Roman legion that gets to it. And literally, in the end, everything turns out all right and everybody bursts into a song.
Saved by the Chinese.
And yeah, saved by the Chinese. And when it was, the interesting thing is, they tried to push it onto Western audiences, into Western cinemas, and the movie flopped incredibly. Nope, I'm the only one that watched it. You're the other person.
No, I didn't watch it.
I'm the only one that watched it. There we go. But the interesting thing was the reviews, because the reviews all scathed this movie for being totally unrealistic. Simply, politics doesn't work like that. It's not about consensus, it's not about peace, and it's definitely not about holding hands and singing a song after everything turns out to be all right. And then these other series, Game of Thrones and so on, are described as realism.
Yeah.
In the sense of apparently there's this completely Hobbesian acceptance for all of us that at the root of it, politics is just this brutal gladiatorial fight, and that is something that you should not hide. But if this is so deeply rooted, then how do we ever stand a chance of getting into another perspective on politics?
Well, I think history goes through cycles. We are in a cycle of cynicism, which I tried to describe in my book. Another cycle will come. I don't know when. I'm 72 now, so I've been going through a few things. And I've been teaching international relations since I was 25, so a long time. And 1989 was the best year of my life politically. I didn't think the collapse of totalitarianism would come so brutally, so rapidly. And you had a feeling of domino game in all the dominoes falling in the right direction. Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria. Europe was reunited behind democracy. Today, I have a feeling in 2018 that we are living the exact opposite of 1989. The dominoes are falling in the wrong direction. The populists come to power in Italy, the Brazilian elect
a nice man, not so nice man.
Someone by the name of Bolsonaro, who immediately appoint as minister in charge of energy and nature, someone who was declared that global warming was fake news. And of course, Trump is in power, and Trump may be re-elected in 2020. But at the same time, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, changes. And it's important to seize the cycle and to decide that it's not forever. You may be losing battles, but you are not losing the war as long as you believe in your principles. I think we in the West have been very guilty of arrogance towards other culture and complacency towards ourselves. And we have to do just the opposite, to be modest with others and to be ambitious with ourselves, to say that, well, there are values which are worth fighting for. I mean, I got the Spinoza Prize. You have two winners, so to speak. 1 year, a dead thinker, and the other year, someone still alive, I hope. And I hope I will survive this lecture. And
30 minutes.
And the man who got the prize and was spared with me was a very noble, courageous, inspiring Czech philosopher by the name of Jan Patočka. And Patočka died in a Socratic manner by fighting in a very tough interrogatory while he knew he had a heart condition, which was very serious, for fighting for his idea and ideals. And he died in 1977. And in 1989, he was the winner. His funeral were attended by thousands and thousands of people in a spontaneous manner, without iPhone, without internet. And it was the first step towards the end of the socialist regime. And the man he fought with, Václav Havel, was 12 years later the president of the Czech Republic. So that is the thing. That's why at the end of my book, I wrote a positive scenario. But unfortunately, I have not been approached by any Netflix, OCS. If you know some of them, ask them to read my book. But, you know, it may come. Will be my retirement pension.
When you talk about these cycles, the question then is, how is this cycle how is such a new cycle initiated? And I was very happy that you mentioned Tolstoy, War and Peace, at the end of the talk, because sometimes Tolstoy's work, War and Peace, is presented, and one of your fellow countrymen, Bruno Latour, writes about this in his work, as somebody who shows that there are no such things as individual politicians or generals that make decisions. So Tolstoy is taken to show that once Tsar Alexander and Napoleon take to the battlefield, of course, afterwards we describe it as if they do all the actions, as if they plan everything, but in reality there's just smoke and gunpowder and delayed messages, and everything plays out much more by ways of context than by individuals. And in your book you mention sometimes that there are such things as great politicians. I think Roosevelt is one that you name. And now also in the example you just mentioned, you name specific individuals, Patočka, Havel, and so on. So where do you stand on this question of how political change happens? Does that happen through strong leaders, strong individuals, or in a more ambiguous manner?
Well, you have to combine both elements. I mean, when you read Stendhal, the Charters of Parma, it starts with Fabrice Del Dongo on the battlefield of Waterloo. He sees smoke, he hears guns, he understands nothing of what's happening. Blood and fury. But somewhere, this is the accident of history. Why did Blücher, the Prussian general, came before the French general? If it had been the reverse, if Grouchy had come before Blücher, the result of the battle would have been different. In the French Revolution, there is a very interesting moment. It's called La fuite à Varennes, the escape to Varennes. The king is leaving, disguised himself like a bourgeois man with a brown habit, takes very bourgeois, bit too big, couch, and goes to join the French army at the frontier with what is now Germany. And he's caught because there is a candle in the street and someone has a little coin in his hand and realize that the man in front of him is the man on his coin. And he says, but that's the king. And the king will never reach the French army. The chances that the king would have been caught were minimal, was sheer accident. But the event transformed history. So history is about the event. But history is also about the man. In June 1940, Europe has been defeated. The Netherlands, Belgium, France have been conquered. Poland has been crushed. Hitler has won. Objectively, Americans are not ready to come. And there is one man, a very eccentric man, a man who had blew it so far, launched strange intervention in World War I that proved to be catastrophic at Gallipoli, crossed the road between parties in the House of Parliament, was bad-tempered, drank too much whiskey, smoked too big cigars.
Stuttered.
But this man decided that Great Britain was not defeated. And in 6 days, he changed the course of history for the best. And so you have to combine that. I think leadership makes a huge difference. I mean, there are two men in the 20th century that changed the course of history. Churchill was one, because he said no to defeat. The other one was Mandela, because he said yes to reconciliation. And this means greatness. It means, I mean, Mandela spent 27 years of his life in the jails of the apartheid regime of South Africa. And he comes out and he embraced de Klerk and he says, let's do peace together. And I met de Klerk. I had the privilege of having a private, face-to-face, the two of us, dinner for 3 hours this year in Italy, because we were at the same conference. And he explained to me that the moment he saw Mandela in the room, he said, well, I can trust him. We'll do great things together. And so when you see those stories, you see, but individuals make a difference. I mean, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there was someone like de Klerk, Rabin, but he was murdered. But probably Arafat was no Mandela. Was it possible for Arafat to become a Mandela? This is a tough story. I don't know. The comparison is daring. But when you say people don't make the difference, I say it's not true. Look, but if you think that individuals are the only actors, no. Look at the event. It's the event. I mean, tomorrow, my country is supposed to be paralyzed by the yellow vest movement. Paris will be blocked. The French love to reenact the French Revolution. We are in 1789 again. So good. And so the sans-culottes have been replaced by the yellow vest. They add a piece of coat instead of leaving their culotte behind them. But in fact, it's not about the French Revolution. It's about the encounter between real suffering and despair and use of this suffering and despair by some extreme rightist and extreme leftist movement. And it's a game. The yellow vest will try to provoke the government to overreact. And hopefully for them, the government will overreact. The government tries to say, I will not overreact. I will be firm, but I will not lose my temper. And you will lose the energy. And this is, but who will decide the event? Someone is killed. More than someone. That's the issue. So it's really what is fascinating about history, it's not written. It's not there. And in the Geopolitics of Emotion, I ended with 2 scenarios for the world in 2025. This is the best scenario, this is the worst scenario. Choose. What do you want the world to be? And you can act upon it.
Then we are still in trouble, because somewhere in the book, in the new book, you write, we live in exceptional times, but we do not have exceptional leaders.
Yeah.
And now we also have very popular series who are not giving us the role models that make young people think, well, I can be the new Churchill,
Yeah.
and this is totally going to work because somewhere politics can be
But that's what
harmonious.
Macron thinks. But he doesn't dream of being the new Churchill, but of being the new Bonaparte. Except that you start like Bonaparte, but you can end up like Napoleon. No, but it's a very important question. The television series like House of Cards, Game of Thrones, create nasty heroes that are, by the end, sympathetic to the audience. Underwood is a monster, but by the end it looks like a friendly monster. I mean, they are using the Shakespearean method. In Shakespeare plays, at some point, the key hero speaks directly to the audience. He doesn't speak to the other actor in the room. He says privately what is happening, what will happen, and creates a direct link between himself and the audience. Underwood does the same thing, sometimes in the most provocative manner, when he says to the audience, looking at them, you know, democracy is very
overrated.
Overrated.
Yeah. So it's going to be a little bit hard to find inspiration for a new cycle of politics. In a totally different register, I wanted to ask this as the first question. I forgot, but I want to ask it now. I guess that if you would ask people, well, how do you study geopolitics? Many people would say, well, you study history, you study the news, and you study statistics, or something like that. But I take it that a lot of people would not expect the geopolitics of today to be accessible through emotions. But that is very explicitly the road that you choose. And I guess I am a bit gossip-like experience, curiosity of how do colleagues in your field respond to that?
Well, I was explaining that when I was elected on a visiting chair at Harvard University, the government department that elected me was deeply divided. All the quantitativists voted against me. All the political philosophers voted for me. And I think there was one voice more. But the chair of the department was on the other side. Well, she never saw me. It was as simple as that. If you are in history, if you are in philosophy, if you are in the humanities, someone who emphasizes the human dimension is welcome. Someone who takes his source of inspiration from music, art, literature, architecture is welcome. If you are a strict political scientist belonging to the quantitativist school, you say, but this man is an imposter, an intruder, is a public intellectual, is not a scientist. In academia, you would never accept that. And I think I will tell you what I said yesterday when I received the prize. I said that my personal history, I'm the son of a survivor of Auschwitz, led me to believe that I had to approach academia not with the idea of deepening sciences, but of awakening consciousness. So I approach academia with an ethical goal. I don't want to impose my vision, but I want to broaden the scope of your thinking. I want to make sure that you open your brain to all the many dimensions that are open to you. And that's my mission, so to speak. And it was not easy, but I was very lucky. I mean, the book has been translated something like 27 languages, is being taught now in the most improbable of countries. Not this book, of course, but the Geopolitics of Emotion. At a congress in Berlin, a man came to me and introduced himself. I'm a professor at the University of Tehran. I've been teaching your book for 5-6 years now. And I realized that this man was not only a professor at the University of Tehran. That was the way he introduced himself. He was the vice prime minister of Iran. He was not really, he was giving, but it was very interesting. And I knew there that I touched the chord, that by explaining what was happening in the Middle East through the culture of humiliation, I was giving something that they could use for themselves, sometimes for the best, sometimes for the worst. But in a way, it worked precisely because I dared to link those two words, geopolitics and emotion, which was an heresy. Geopolitics is about realism, cold monster. Emotion are about the affect. But then I said, but really, I've been meeting with the leaders of the world. And I know their affect, their subjectivity plays a major role in their decision. So let's go to the essence of it. Let's not be satisfied only with the protection they create around themselves. I mean, it started when I was traveling to the Middle East. When I would go to Israel, I would be received by the French ambassador in Tel Aviv, and I would meet Israelis. And the other day, I would be received by the Consul General of France in Jerusalem, and I would meet Palestinians. And I realized the conflict was not about, it was about territory, it was about security, but it was about emotion. The culture of humiliation of the Palestinian, the culture of fear and resentment of the Israelis. And if you didn't bring the two people to come closer to each other through emotions, there was no way they could come closer to each other. For the moment, they have not come closer to each other because there's too much of a disequilibrium between the Israelis that are too strong and feel too vulnerable, and the Palestinians who are too weak and too divided. But this is, I think, my answer to your question.
Thank you.
You have to, yeah, it was a risk. It was a huge risk, but I felt it was my duty. I mean, there's a moment when academic career is behind you, and you are totally free to write even senseless book like the Geopolitics of Political Series and be translated in 10 languages and still keep your emeritus status at university.